Welcome to HortTube, where we talk all things gardening. My name is Jim Putnam, and this is an Andorra Compacta Juniper. This is Andorra Compacta Juniper, a low-growing, spreading, ground-cover juniper that turns a plum color in the wintertime and is actually soft to the touch. Andorra Compacta is a low-spreading juniper that only reaches probably a foot in height, maybe a little more than that, but it definitely has this low spreading habit and can probably reach 5 or maybe even 8 feet in width over time. Andorra Compacta Juniper will grow in almost the entire continental United States. This plant will go all the way up to zone 3. I mean, really cold overnight temperatures in the wintertime, and then all the way down to zone 9. Which is, I think, just like 30 degrees is your average low temperature in zone 9. So this plant is very versatile and will cover a wide range of temperatures. Andorra is a moderately slow grower. Most of these ground cover junipers are not the quickest things in the world. We might add about 6 inches in width a year to these if we're fertilizing them, a little less if we're not. Andorra Compacta Juniper, like most junipers, would prefer almost full sun. These would definitely require at least a half a day sun. And that's the midday sun, not early in the morning, not late in the evening. You have to get at least half of the midday sun, sometime between 10 and 4 would be ideal. And then all the way to full sun. These wouldn't mind baking at all on the side of a slope in the absolute full sun or in a parking lot in a commercial setting. In terms of usage for Andorra Compacta, this is a plant that's most of the time going to be used as a ground cover. It works just absolutely fantastic, covering a bank, covering a slope, planting it near a wall. This thing will actually, in time, these pieces will come down over the edge and weep down. Works great for any of those applications. It also works well as like the front layer on a foundation planting. If you have taller things in the back, this would definitely work well as something that stays low and is low maintenance on the front of the bed. The width over time can be an issue, but it's not the fastest growing thing in the world, so that could easily be controlled and not, take over the bed really quickly or anything like that. Andorra could also just be mass planted in a large grouping, maybe put something flowering behind it. This plum purple color that this plant turns in the wintertime is quite beautiful. One of the nicest things about Andorra Compacta is it actually turns a plum purple color in the winter, and it's quite beautiful. And the colder the area that you're in, the more of that color shows up. If you're in zones 8 and 9, it's probably not going to be as dark of a plum purple color. It's probably going to have some of that green mixed in toward the center of the plant. But if you're in zones 3 to 6 and maybe into 7A, it turns a very beautiful winter plum purple color. In terms of planting Andorra Compacta, like most junipers, it's extremely drought tolerant, but it's not going to be tolerant of sitting in a wet space. So this is why this plant's a perfect candidate for a slope, because slopes tend to dry out between rains, whereas flat areas around your foundation aren't going to dry out as readily. So if you're planting this in a flat space, if you're mass planting it in a flat area or up against your foundation, make sure that you're elevating this plant above the existing soil grade. So dig your hole the depth of the root ball of the plant. And then if you have clay soils, mix in some pine bark soil conditioner. It's what I'm growing these in. It's a aged pine bark mix that we use to grow these in, and it's great for mixing in the clay because it allows water to kind of pass through the clay more easily. Also aerates the clay as well. If you have sandier soils, you might want to mix in a little bit of compost, but like I say, this plant wants to be on the dry side, so I wouldn't go crazy with that. Maybe a third mix with some compost or some cow manure or some peat moss if it's very sandy, if you're out in a coastal area, that kind of thing. Like I say, dig it to the depth of the root ball. Take some of that mix that you just made with the soil that came out of the hole and whatever soil amendment you used, and put some of that in the bottom of the hole, maybe 2 inches, so that when we place this plant into that hole, the plant ends up sticking up that 2 inches. And then we'll pull our soil up to the edge of that, and then we want to very lightly mulch these. If you're in an area that pine straw is available to you as a mulch option, I would use pine straw. Pine straw definitely allows the soil to breathe a little more and dry out a little more than a heavy, double shredded pine bark or brown mulch or black mulch or any of that mulch you might use may end up keeping these too wet. But we do need to mulch them because if they get weedy early on while we're trying to establish them as a ground cover and we're trying to get them to grow together, if there are weeds growing in the middle of it, that's going to take a lot of energy away from that process. One other issue you may have when you're planting junipers of any kind, ground cover juniper or upright juniper, the roots may be wrapped around one another pretty aggressively inside these containers. Junipers can end up being quite root bound. Sometimes we'll see them just root out of the bottom of the pots in the nursery. When you pull this out of the pot, you're going to want to pull at them some to break them apart a little bit. Another issue about planting these, junipers can make some people very itchy, so you may want to wear gloves when you're handling junipers. Don't know if that'll happen to you. Doesn't really bother me, but some people will break out a little bit when they're handling junipers. One of the other nice thing about Andorra is it's extremely soft. A lot of the other junipers are very prickly. This one I don't have any problem just grabbing a hold of. It's, you know, quite soft to the touch. But again, break these roots apart, pull at them a little bit. If it's really, really bad, you can take a knife, cut into them about 1/2 inch in maybe 3 spots, top to bottom, and that will get the roots going outward instead of continuing to wrap around one another. If you're planting your Andorra junipers in somewhere where it's a flat space and you get rainfall kind of on a normal rotation, you know, at least once a month or so you're getting rain. And once this thing's established, you're not going to need to do any additional watering. I would say after 6 months, this thing could probably be on its own, you know, 9 months maybe. It can be on its own. You're not going to have to do any additional watering. If you put this thing on a slope and you're trying to you're trying to use it as a ground cover, it is going to dry out more in between rains. And if we went a month without water, you might want to consider watering them. The best way to do that is when you plant them is to run a drip hose in whatever pattern you plant these in. You know, put the drip hose above the plants. That's important. The water is going to go down the hill when it runs. So put a drip hose above them, and that way you can plug your water hose into it and turn on the water and water your bank without having to stand there with the water hose for a long time. You might have to do that a few times during the summer, especially when you're trying to get them to grow, because if they become dry, it probably won't hurt them, but they will stop growing, and that'll take some, you know, it'll extend the period of time it takes to create a ground cover. In terms of fertilizing your junipers, I would definitely fertilize them in mid-spring with a slow release fertilizer. These are acid loving plants, so if you can find a slow release fertilizer for acid loving plants, that's ideal. Sometimes I'll say azalea, camellia, rhododendron fertilizers. Those are for acid loving plants. That'd be a great choice. While I'm trying to establish these and I'm trying to cover some space, I would probably do it in the early spring, maybe in March, and then again in the early summer, so that we're putting growth on. And once they're established, maybe just once a year in the spring, that'll keep a nice rich green color on these. This is October now, and these are starting to make a turn toward that plum color where they were much darker green just a few weeks ago. If your junipers get wider than you need them to, you can cut them pretty much anytime you want to. This thing will branch this way and then come up, branch this way and then come up. You can cut any of those branches off, and you can cut them all the way back to the middle if you need to, or you can just generally come around the edge and shape these up. You're not going to need to do that on a slope probably if you're spacing them 4 or 5 feet apart, but on a foundation, this thing probably will end up wider than you want over time. It's slow growing, so you're probably going to have to do this maybe once every 2 or 3 years. And when you do it, cut it further than you want to cut it so that it has a chance to come out and kind of have this natural spiky look to it. If you're constantly cutting it exactly the size you need to keep it, it will never have a chance to come back out and do this. So, you know, if you're trying to keep it 3 foot wide and it's become 4 foot wide, I might cut it back to 2 feet wide. That way I get 2 more years of it coming out and having this more natural look to it. In terms of insect and disease problems, junipers are susceptible to spider mites. Usually that's going to occur on stressed plants. If the plant is abnormally wet or in too much shade or overly mulched or, you know, just stressed in some way, that's typically when we'll see mite problems. It really doesn't have a lot of other insect problems. They are vulnerable to root rot, and we definitely don't want to keep these in an area where it's going to stay wet between rains. One issue ground cover junipers can have in time is because the foliage grows so close to the ground, they're actually very good at collecting all of your leaves and things that blow into them, and in time can actually create wet conditions just accidentally, just by collecting leaves and having them rot under them. So in the fall, if they are in an area that's got trees near them, you don't want to plant these in a shady space, but if there are trees near them and there are leaves blowing onto that bank, I would do your best to remove as many as you can every fall, because it can be a long-term issue. So what are you waiting for? Even you can grow the low maintenance, ground cover, soft to the touch Andorra Compacta Juniper. Thank you for watching. And if this video was helpful, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel for future videos. Also, comment below with any questions you have about Andorra Compacta or any other ground cover junipers. Thanks again.